Well, primarily it is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, especially those freedoms and rights that are in sections 2, 6, 7, and 15 of the Charter, which I helped craft. And they're freedoms of association, freedoms of expression, religion, conscience, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, that's in section 2. Section 6, freedom of mobility, the right to travel anywhere in Canada or leave Canada. Section 6 deals with life, liberty, and the security of the person. And Section 15 with equality. Every Canadian is equal before the law. As we sit here today, those provisions are being violated by all the governments of Canada, but in particular, in my case right now, the federal government of Canada, and I'm about to launch a lawsuit against the federal government because of these mandates, especially their travel ban. There's no other travel ban in the Western world like this one, and yet we're the second largest country in the world by geography. This impinges upon my right of travel, my right to travel to my family back east or my friends. It takes away my right as a Canadian to be protected by the mobility right of Section 6.
Okay,
and therefore,
okay,
I feel that the federal government has overreached its authority.
Okay, so let me get this clear, because I'm still having a hard time conceptualizing the fact that this is actually a reality. So the situation we have in Canada is that a former drafter of what is one of the most fundamental articles of our shared agreement as a people is now about to launch a legal claim against the government itself for violating the fundamental principles upon which the entire country is founded and assembled and agrees. That's not too blunt?
No, that is very, very accurate. That's exactly what's happening. I'm the only First Minister left alive who was at that conference and helped draft these freedoms and these rights and the Constitution Act of 1982 itself. And I do this very reluctantly. I've been watching this thing now for almost 2 years. I've been speaking out about it at public meetings and on my blog and so on. And I've come to the conclusion now that I must, as a Canadian, and as one of the writers and founders of the Constitution Act of 1982, not only speak about it, I must act about it. I must show Canadians that I'm so concerned as a citizen and as a former First Minister that helped craft this Constitution Act 1982, that I must take action against my own government because they have violated rights that I and others helped craft in 1981, 1982.
Well, what do you think the legal response to this is going to be? You've obviously, and I know this, of course, is you've been consulting with a legal team, I suppose, and we can talk about that. I mean, it seems to me that this puts the courts in an awfully complicated position, to say the absolute least, because it's, and please correct me if I'm misstepping in any way here, it's up to the courts to determine the letter, but also the spirit of these fundamental laws. And it seems to me that it's almost inarguable that if you have a living member of the body that drafted the provisions making the claim that they're being violated, that that's as good an indication about the violation of the spirit of the law, certainly, and perhaps the letter as well, that you could possibly have. Am I summing that up accurately?
Yes, you are. And other lawyers, including the lawyers that will be representing me now in this lawsuit, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, have looked at the situation very carefully. And it's after weeks and weeks of deliberation that we've decided upon this action. So the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms will be launching this lawsuit in the next 24 hours or so on behalf of me and a number of other Canadians. But of course, because of my present status and previous status as a First Minister, this becomes elevated and perhaps more public than it would otherwise become. But this is my deliberate consideration and that of my lawyers of what is going on in this country. What is happening is that there is a section in Charter of Rights and Freedoms which allows governments to override these freedoms in unusual circumstances. And I remember this very well when we were crafting the Constitution. These unusual circumstances, because we're putting it in the Constitution, it's not a federal act or a provincial act. It's in a Constitution which is supposed to enshrine permanent values and give glue to the country. Okay, so this section 1 can only be used, and I remember this well, in times of peril, in times of war and insurrection, or when the state is in peril, when the existence of the state is in peril. This particular virus, for which there's a recovery of 99%, a fatality rate of less than 1%, does not constitute, in my view, a situation where the country is in peril. And therefore, I argue that Section 1 doesn't even apply, even though they're trying to make it apply and use that as the reason for doing what they're doing.
So you're saying that in your estimation, and this is a consequence of the knowledge that you bring forth from conferring with all the people who drafted this legislation to begin with at the provincial and the federal level, that when you drafted it, you did not envision that its provisions could be violated under conditions that weren't a threat, like a fundamental threat to the integrity of the country itself. And
Exactly.
that the current state of affairs on the public health front does in no way meet that criteria.
Absolutely. It does not at all meet that criteria. And even in the extreme circumstance, because we're all fair people, that you tried to make Section 1 apply. And you said what Peckford and others are saying happened in 81, 82, when Section 1 doesn't apply, does apply. Then there were 4 tests that had to be met in order for it to apply. That means it must be demonstrably justified that what the action is worthwhile. In other words, some kind of cost-benefit analysis. It must be done by law. It must be done in reasonable limits. And fourthly, and most importantly, all of those 3 must be done within the context of a free and democratic society. And a free and democratic society, to me, means parliamentary democracy in our country. We have 14 parliaments, and they have been completely silent. There's no parliamentary committee anywhere in any of those 14 parliaments looking at what's happening to our country. There are the people's representatives. And so,
okay, so you're also saying, and this is also terrible, that you're also saying that even the process itself by which these exceptions could be made has been essentially subverted in the name of something approximating expediency, but that the rationale for that expediency does not indicate a level of seriousness sufficient to justify that expedient process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Exactly what I'm saying. And I think that's extremely unfortunate. And I don't only speak for myself on this. There's quite a few experts around, like the Great Barrington Declaration over a year ago now identified, and these were some of the greatest epidemiologists in the world, how to approach this kind of a situation, okay? And that's their principles still stand, you know. You protect the vulnerable. You do everything to protect the vulnerable in this kind of situation. And by the way, this is not new. All of the provinces of Canada have what's called emergency measures organizations, which we spend all these millions on as taxpayers, who do nothing else, so sit down every day and organize a plan for some kind of an emergency declared, let's admit, maybe an emergency, or at least a very serious situation in the country. And then they bring to bear all of the planning tools that are necessary, not just a narrow clinical one from the Department of Health.
Right.
And see how is the best way. And Lieutenant Colonel David Redmond out of Alberta, who wrote the new Emergency Measures Act there, speaks eloquently to this and has produced all kinds of documents that nobody has challenged, that this was the appropriate approach to take.
Okay, so there's 2 issues that stem out of that. The first is what has also happened, and you're making allusion to that, is that our political leaders have not only circumvented the parliamentary process to produce provisions that violate the Canadian Charter of Rights, but they've abdicated their responsibility for overall governance, which is the balancing of all sorts of competing interests, to a narrow so-called public health policy. So, and that's also inappropriate governance in the most fundamental sense.
Yes, absolutely, no question. And if anybody looks at the documentation that Lieutenant Colonel David Redmond has produced, they will be convinced that, and you know, we had the swine flu and other flus before this one, other infectious diseases, and that's why these emergency measures organizations were put in place for, you know, like when the river floods in Winnipeg, or when we have, you know, an ice storm in Quebec or whatever, that there are people who have already planned for all of this and have already contacted the private sector, the public sector, all the relevant government departments. So when something happens, they're ready to move quickly on all fronts and have a very joint effort to ensure that the totality of society is considered. Isn't compromised, and you put in measures which acknowledge all the factors. Because now we know from studies that have been produced, even by Dr. Douglas Allen of Simon Fraser University, who looked at 80 studies over a year ago, which showed that the cure was worse than the disease. In other words, the lockdowns caused so many problems on the other side that was difficult to justify the measures that were being used.
Okay, now you alluded to the fact too that this isn't in some sense common public knowledge, and then along with that, we're faced with the extreme oddity, I would say, of the fact that the venue that you chose to announce this move and to discuss all these issues isn't a standard news media venue. It's my YouTube channel. And one of the things that you discussed with me earlier this week was the impossibility, in your view, of having these topics dealt with in an honest and straightforward manner by any major news organization in Canada, which to me is almost an statement damning the current larger scale governance structure, which in some sense includes a free press operating in a coherent and articulate and trustworthy manner as a check and an opportunity for reflection on the political process. And so that in itself seems as worrisome as all the other things that we're talking about at a governmental level. Like, I think this is preposterous in some sense that this is the place where this discussion is taking place. And so,
especially when they have not gone out of their way to demonstrably justify, which is one of the tests of Section 1. Where is the demonstrable justification of what they're doing? One would think in public policy since my time, and long before when I was a premier, one of the things governments did when they were introducing, especially brand new legislation, and doing very serious things with the Constitution would be to do a cost-benefit analysis. And based upon that, you would decide how you went forward. None of that was done. No parliamentary committee was ever struck to look at both sides of the issue and call in experts. All of these kinds of reasonable measures, which were part of the Canadian fabric of developing public policy, have been discarded in this particular...
So what are people doing? I've spoken to Rex Murphy about that, and Rex has been the only journalist, perhaps, who's been beating the warning drum, trying to alert Canadians to the fact that the parliamentary process itself has been subverted at the federal and the provincial levels. And he's certainly been allowed to express those views, but I don't think Canadians have any real sense of exactly how serious that is. So one question would be, well, if our laws are no longer... if the laws that restrict our charter freedoms are no longer being produced by parliamentary debate, how are they being produced? And so that'd be the first question. How is this occurring? Is it just by fiat? Is it just by statement? And if so, why are these laws to be regarded as valid at all? And if they're not valid, well, what does that mean?
Yeah, well, here's where the most insidious part of this equation comes into play. What the governments have done have used, in very many cases, existing legislation under which they have the power to make regulation. So they've used existing emergencies, legislation, and inflated it enough or interpreted it in a manner that they could also use in this circumstance and therefore issue additional regulation. And then in other cases, they did not fully explain or have a parliamentary committee look at other amendments when they opened their parliament and closed it within 2 or 3 days or a week. In other words, sufficient debate wasn't allowed to understand the repercussions of what they were doing when they were giving more power to the minister and more power to the public health officer.
Right. So this really means in some sense that none of these policies were subject to opposition. Because we could delve into that a little bit. You might say, well, in an emergency such that provisions shouldn't be subject to opposition because that's inefficient. But that is the same thing as saying two things. One is that they shouldn't be thought about because discussion between opposing parties is actually thought. And then the second thing it's saying is they should be implemented without recourse to the broader public, because the broader public is represented in that oppositional structure so that everybody's voices are being allowed to be heard. That's in some sense the whole point of the parliament, where parliament means place of talking fundamentally, and it means more deeply than that, place of thinking, and even more deeply than that, place of discussion of the entire panoply of public opinion. That's all gone by the wayside in the name of efficiency, let's say, or something like that.
Yes, doctor, and even it gets worse than that, because we have had time. One can perhaps relieve or excuse, if one wants to make so that the argument is completely reasonable, and say, for the first 90 days, when this thing began, you could make an argument that, okay, the government's had to move. But in any rational way, if they had used the emergency measures planning that was already in place, they would have moved to protect the vulnerable first, and then did a study on the rest. What else do we need to do in society? What they did is just a carte blanche over all of society without giving second thought to it. And now all of the studies, 90 days after this started, and 100 days, 120 days, show, right? And then the Great Barrington Declaration is a good example. Over a year old now is the Great Barrington Declaration. So they had lots of information. And Dr. Allen's report from Simon Fraser over a year ago. So they've had lots of information and scientific studies about what's going on to demonstrate that not only are the vaccines destructive, more destructive than any vaccines in our history, and that's a scientific fact, then they had time to adjust. And this is where they have not even been nimble in this kind of circumstance, when you think this is the very time that governments would be nimble. Okay, we'll see what we can do with the vulnerable, all these long-term care homes and the hospitals, and those who are most vulnerable. And we'll now have the parliamentary committee on an expedited basis. I understand that. On an emergency basis, bring in experts from both sides within the next 30 days to see what else we should do in a reasonable and graduated way, or are what we're doing now the most appropriate way to respond to it.
Right.
So none of that was done.
So your case is, well, in the early stages of the emergency of the pandemic, when people didn't understand the magnitude of the risk, there was potential for justification for reducing parliamentary complexity to short-term efficiency. But as the pandemic has unfolded and we've become more aware of its true risks or lack thereof, we should have returned to the principles of parliamentary democracy as rapidly as possible. And with less and less justification, that's continued to happen. That circumvention of the parliamentary process has continued to happen. And I suppose that culminated in recent months with the Quebec lockdown, the curfew. I don't see how anybody can possibly make the case that that curfew was implemented under conditions that were as uncertain and dire as those that obtained in the initial phases of the pandemic, especially given that Omicron is obviously much less serious than the original virus. And also, we've already attained something approximating an 80% vaccination rate. And that's not going to be pushed up much higher than 90% without government intervention that becomes unbelievably heavy-handed. So there's less and less justification for more and more circumvention of parliamentary processes as this proceeds, instead of exactly the opposite.
Exactly. And that's why it took me this long to be convinced that I had to take this action. I mean, I never took this action 90 days after they brought in these things, or 100 days, or a year after, right? I've been watching this and commenting and making, articulating my concerns as Rex has. By the way, Rex and Murphy and I went to university together. We're both Newfoundlanders. We're all both born in Newfoundland. And I've heard him on your program with you and enjoyed the conversation and love the English literature and the classics like he does. And we both got a very wonderful education at Memorial in those days. It's no longer there now, but we did. And I do appreciate his commentary and what he's brought to this discussion. It's very, very important. But the other thing is, as you say, the transmission of the virus now, and the virus has changed. So a lot of the vaccines that are being used are no longer applicable. They don't do anything to the existing variant that we have. They were devised for another variant, or for the original virus. And the other thing is, people getting aboard planes, and my travel ban that arguing on before the lawsuit is that everybody transmits it now, unvaccinated and vaccinated, receive and transmit the virus. So it's hard to make the argument that the travel ban should be in place if the transmission of the virus, for which all of this is centered, is no longer valid. That is that the vaccinated protect against the virus because they receive it and transmit it the same as the unvaccinated. And now we find in Denmark, Israel, just in the last few days, right, and Australia, their case rates have gone through the roof again, even though they're 90% vaccinated. And so the whole basis, right, the whole basis of this argument of these lockdowns and travel bans and so on, the basis has crumbled, right? The whole citadel on which this so-called rational approach to a virus has completely crumbled and no longer can sustain itself. So one must then question, why is this continuing to be in place when all of that data is available, which at least...
Well, I can tell you what I've been informed of about why it's continuing. And I had a conversation with a senior advisor to one of Canadians' provincial governments, a number of conversations. Some of those were conducted with Rex. None of this was made public because the conversation occurred in privacy. And I asked the gentleman I was speaking with why he wouldn't go public. And he said, and I believe honorably, that he believed he could still do more good from within the confines of the governmental structure than as a lone voice crying in the wilderness, let's say. But he told me flat out that Canadian public policy is being so it's not being generated through the parliamentary process that it's supposed to be generated through. What's happening instead is the politicians are turning to badly sampled opinion polls, short-term opinion polls, and driving policy as a consequence. And then they're not actually driving it as a consequence of public opinion polls, because that would be something like consulting the people. They're utilizing adherence to short-term public opinion polls to maximize the probability that they'll obtain political success in the electoral sphere in the near future. And so I said, I pressed him, I said, so you're telling me that this isn't based on the science, because that's certainly what we're hearing. And he said, no, it's not based on the science. That's not driving the decisions. I asked him, is there an end game in place, which is, do we have definitions laid down for when the pandemic is now of sufficient lack of severity that it's over, so to speak, and we can go back to normal life? Is there even a conceptual framework within which that might occur? And the answer to that was, no, there's not that as well. And so it was one of the most shocking conversations I think I've ever had in my life, in some sense, because I'm not a cynic about the political process. I think that cheap cynicism about politics is it's an abdication of civic responsibility, and it's bitterness masquerading as wisdom. But then when I heard that the situation at the highest levels of governance was more cynical and less responsible than I could have even imagined, and that even when I pushed that interpretation to see if I was misinterpreting, the answer I received was a definitive no. It's as bad as you think or worse. And I didn't really know what to make of that in the aftermath of the conversation, because, well, for all the reasons that we're discussing, it's like, well, have things really got to the point where we don't use parliamentary process? We're violating the Canadian Charter of Bill of Rights. The press is so involved in collusion that they won't even report on it, and they're being subsidized to a great degree by the government in some sense for doing so, and that's so widespread that it covers the entire legacy media, let's say. It's like, it sounds conspiratorial in the deepest sense. And
that's why a lot of people have gone that route, is because they have been almost pushed in that route. And you see the government then using their polling, here they are out advertising, you've got to get vaccinated on the television, and they're actually even doing ads for children and trying to talk to children directly through a public ad. So they're feeding off themselves. They're creating enough fear so that they'll get the poll they want to get. So what has happened in the last 40 years, they have not noticed, because we have not been civically involved like we should. I say in all my public meetings, the level of good democracy is directly related to the amount of civic involvement.
Right.
The less civic involvement, the less democracy. And this is what's happened in Canada.
Yeah, well, that cheap cynicism interferes with that too. And what that means is that because people are cynical and they think that's wisdom, then they abandon these institutions. And then when they're abandoned, that means that maybe the people who shouldn't be running them are able to run them, and then the whole thing gets corrupted from the bottom up. And that's happening. I see that happening with school boards in particular. It's absolutely appalling.
It's happening all over the place. And the Parliament of Canada is not the Parliament that you and I grew up with, okay? Where the MP had really significant power, where the parliamentary committee had really significant power. And this is true in all the provinces as well. There's been a gradual shift of power from the Parliament, first to the Cabinet, and now to the First Minister's office, both in all the provinces and in the Government of Canada. Donald J. Savoy has written a book on this called Democracy in Canada, the Disintegration of Our Institutions. It's only a couple of years old. It's a haunting book, but he's one of the experts in governance in Canada, and he's a scholar at the University of Moncton. And this is more or less his epic book. He's written quite a few books on this over the years. And this is a book that every thinking Canadian should read, because it methodically and intelligently deals with how, over time, without a shot being fired, the movement of power from where it should reside in the Parliament all the way to the Prime Minister's office and the Premier's office. And this, therefore, this situation in early 2020, we were very vulnerable to this kind of thing happening by governments, because we have been led into that kind of atmosphere over time, with power shifting and therefore exercise of power quickly by the executive rather than by the Parliament.
Okay, so we've outlined to some degree what it means if the challenge that you're proposing to mount fails. And what it'll mean is that what's happening now with the centralization of power and the circumventing of the parliamentary process and the reliance, let's say, on opinion polls and whim, and the abdication of responsibility for governing to so-called experts who are unidimensional in their viewpoint, that's the status quo, and that's becoming more and more the norm. I don't understand what'll happen if you win. I mean, because if you win, it means that that the laws that have governed us for the last, let's say, year, 2 years, accepting that initial period of, maybe we could say, uncertainty bordering on the level of potential emergency, if you win, what does that mean for the political sovereignty of the federal and provincial governments?
I think what that means is that if we win, we have identified that we have some very substantial laws on the books that, when challenged and brought rationally towards our highest courts, will be honored. And that will give Canadians faith to reform either the existing political parties or go with new political parties that recognize in their platform, which they've signed off on with the people, that they respect the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and only in very dire circumstances, like a war, insurrection, can it be circumvented, right? That we must get back to a parliamentary type of democracy. The power must be returned to the Parliament. Look, Jody Raybo, when she argued as a Minister of Justice and then later wanted to appear before a parliamentary committee, she was allowed to appear a couple of times, then they shut the committee down, even though she indicated in writing that she had more information that she wanted to present. So there was the complete, what shall I say, tyranny of the majority, and for the parliamentary system to work. We have examples all over the place of this in all of the parliaments of Canada. So if we win, I think it will restore some confidence in our system with Canadians, and tell them that, yes, we have to reform the system more, and we can go with other political parties or reform the existing ones, so that these leaders understand and revise their platforms to get back to what is true parliamentary democracy in our country. That's the best that we can see come out of that.
So what does it say about, if you win, what does it say about the culpability of our current political leaders? I mean, I don't understand if their policies have been shown to violate the most fundamental principles upon which our country maintains its peace and prosperity, its integrity. If they violated that, What does that mean for them? What are the consequences of that?